is closing in on Kyiv. It is slow progress against a fierce Ukrainian resistance that has turned the capital city into a fortress. The Pentagon says one Russian approach to the city is about 10 miles outside the city's center. Satellite images show that the convoy of Russian tanks stalled outside Kyiv for days has now largely dispersed, but it's unclear what the movement means for the capital. Oren Lieberman, CNN at the Pentagon.
And let's bring in CNN military analyst, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertlein. Thanks for being with us. What do you make of these Russian strikes and the increased Russian military advances into western Ukraine?
Well, it was a minimal strike. I think what we're talking about is 3 or 4 cruise missiles on that airfield. And truthfully, I can't make anything of it. It's very confusing to me from an operational or strategic perspective. The city of Lutsk that they hit this morning is an old historic city. It has about 200,000 population. The only thing I can figure is that the Russians thought that it might be able to disrupt both the refugees going out and potentially NATO lethal aid coming in. But I believe the real rationale behind it is to just continue the terror, to show Ukrainians throughout the country that Russia is hitting everywhere. It just doesn't make sense from a military perspective, but then none of these strikes against cities do make sense because none of them are military targeted.
Similarly in Dnipro as well, which hadn't been hit, a shoe factory, an apartment block, a school. I mean, it does remind me a little bit of what the Assad regime, with the help of Russians, did in Syria, where it was really terror from the skies aimed at frightening civilians and diverting sort of military resources to dealing with civilian casualties.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. This has become the Russian way of war. The Dnipro strike, I think, is a little bit different than the Lutsk strike, because you see that town of Dnipro halfway between Mariupol and Kharkiv. And I think what part of the original plan in that secondary effort was to do a surrounding and envelopment movement for the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass. But they haven't executed that plan very well. They're still stalled in and around Kharkiv, and Mariupol has just become a scorched earth city right now. You're exactly right that I think the Russian forces did not come into this fight with enough ground forces to truly occupy any of the places they thought were their main objectives. So what they've done is they've reverted to the same kind of tactics that they used in Idlib and other places within Syria, where they bomb cities, caused a refugee flow, and then bomb the next cities that those refugees go to. It's a rinse and repeat kind of tactic, which is just incredibly horrific.
And what about Kyiv? So we're seeing that column of armored vehicles that was static for several days disperse and regroup. What are your expectations? I know it's very difficult to predict the future, but your expectations for what the Russians may have planned for the capital itself?
Well, what they've planned and what they've executed so far is very disconnected. Those 3 columns of Russian vehicles coming in from the northwest, the north, and from the east out of Kharkiv and Sumy have been stalled by Ukrainian fighters and the territorial units. I think what we haven't seen is a whole lot of movement in either one of those 3 columns over the last 4 days. I think that's partly because they've had some major problems with the tactical units themselves, but they've also had unbelievably poor logistics support, and those logistics columns have been trapped both from the north and the south, and Ukrainian fighters are reportedly piecemealing, destroying those columns. One of the things I've seen today, Ale, which I find very interesting, is in pictures of Ukrainian fighters, that both the army and the territorial forces, every single soldier you see walking on the battlefield has not only their rifle, but also some type of anti-tank weapon. Every single one of them has either AT-4 or a javelin across their back. I think that's critically important. They also have night vision goggles, which the Russians don't have. So they're taking this fight full time to the Russians, and I think the Russians are suffering not only with bad tactics, but very poor morale right now.
But they're suffering, but then they're using those aerial bombardment tactics on, as we mentioned, Lutsk, for instance, as kind of a head scratcher. But can the Ukrainians resist here? Because it's a very tough battle against a very powerful military, even if they've made tactical and strategic mistakes.
I think they've made more than just mistakes. This has been, the Russian army has shown their incompetence at both the operational and the tactical level across the board. They've had 3 generals killed within a 2-week period of time, trying to lead from the front because the junior leaders aren't doing it. They seem to have a plan to insert a second echelon, which has always been a Russian doctrinal tenet, but no second echelon has come because they can't even get the supply lines in, and they've already put the majority of their forces inside the country. I truly believe, whereas it appears that Russia is a very well-equipped army, their training and their leadership is horrible, and whereas the Ukrainian army may not be as strong in terms of equipment and devices, they're getting a lot of support from their allies and friends, and they have the will to fight. I think when you combine the quantity or the quantity of the force versus the will of the other force, you're going to see a mismatch and a disconnect. And I think the Ukraine army is really taking it to them right now.
Right, and as you mentioned, they have much heavier weaponry this time around. Thanks very much, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Always a pleasure speaking to you. We'll be in touch in the coming hours. Well,